Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Spirit, the true spirit. The ethical order. Spirit is, in its simple truth, consciousness, and forces its moments apart. Action divides it into substance and consciousness of the substance, and divides the substance as well as consciousness. Substance, as the universal essence and end, stands over against the individualized reality. The infinite middle term is self-consciousness, which, being the implicit unity of itself and substance, now becomes that unity explicitly and unites the universal essence and its individualized reality. The latter it raises to the former and acts ethically. The former it brings down to the latter and realizes the end, the substance which had an existence only in thought. It brings into existence the unity of itself and substance as its own work, and thus as an actual existence. In this separation of the moments of consciousness, the simple substance has, on the one hand, preserved the antithesis to self-consciousness, and the other it equally exhibits in its own self the nature of consciousness, namely to create distinctions within itself, exhibiting itself as a world articulated into its separate spheres. It thus splits itself up into distinct ethical substances, into a human and a divine law. Similarly, the self-consciousness confronting the substance assigns to itself, according to its nature, one of these powers, and as a knowing is on the one hand ignorant of what it does, and on the other knows what it does, a knowledge which for that reason is a deceptive knowledge. It learns through its own act the contradiction of those powers into which the substance divided itself and their mutual downfall, as well as the contradiction between its knowledge of the ethical character of its action and what is in its own proper nature ethical, and thus finds its own downfall. In point of fact, however, the ethical substance has developed through this process into actual self-consciousness. In other words, this particular self has become the actuality of what it is in essence. But precisely in this development, the ethical order has been destroyed. The ethical world, human and divine law, man and woman. Woman is one of my favorite topics. So here we go. The simple substance of spirit as consciousness is divided. In other words, just as the consciousness of abstract sensuous being passes over into perception, so also does the immediate certainty of a real ethical situation. And just as for sense perception simple being becomes a thing of many properties, so for ethical perception a given action is an actual situation with many ethical connections. For the former, however, the superfluous plurality of properties concentrates itself into the essential antithesis of individuality and universality, and still more for ethical perception, which is the purified substantial consciousness. Does the plurality of ethical moments become the duality of a law of individuality and a law of universality. But each of these divisions of substance remains spirit in its entirety. If in sense perception things have no other substance than the two determinations of individuality and universality, here the two determinations express only the superficial antithesis of the two sides. In the essence we are considering here, individuality has the meaning of self-consciousness in general, not of a particular contingent consciousness. In this determination, therefore, the ethical substance is actual substance, absolute spirit realized in the plurality of existing consciousnesses. This spirit is the community which, when we entered the sphere of reason in its practical embodiment, was for us absolute essence, and here has emerged on its own account in its truth as conscious ethical essence, and as essence for the consciousness which here is our object. It is spirit which is for itself in that it preserves itself in its reflection in individuals, and it is implicitly spirit or substance in that it preserves them within itself. As actual substance, it is a nation. As actual consciousness, it is the citizens of that nation. This consciousness has its essence in simple spirit, and the certainty of itself in the actuality of the spirit in the nation as a whole. It has its truth, therefore, not in something that is not actual, but in a spirit that exists and prevails. This spirit can be called the human law because it is essentially in the form of a reality that is conscious of itself. In the form of universality, it is the known law and the prevailing custom. In the form of individuality, it is the actual certainty of itself in the individual as such, and the certainty of itself as a simple individuality is that spirit as government. Its truth is the authority which is openly accepted and manifest to all. A concrete existence which appears for immediate certainty in the form and existence that has freely issued forth. Confronting this clearly manifest ethical power, there is, however, another power, the divine law. For the ethical power of the state, being the movement of self-conscious action, finds its antithesis in the simple and immediate essence of the ethical sphere. As actual universality, it is a force actively opposed to individual being for self, and as actuality in general, it finds in that inner essence something other than the ethical power of the state. It has already been mentioned that each of the opposites in which the ethical substance exists contains the entire substance and all the moments of its content. If then the community is that substance, conscious of what it actually does, the other side has the form of immediate substance, or substance that simply is. The latter is thus on the one hand the inner notion, or general possibility, of the ethical sphere in general, but on the other hand equally contains within it the moment of self-consciousness. This moment which expresses the ethical sphere in this element of immediacy, or simple being, or which is an immediate consciousness of itself, both as essence and as this particular self, is another. And that is, as a natural ethical community, this is the family. The family as the unconscious, still inner notion of the ethical order stands opposed to its actual self-conscious existence. As the element of the nation's actual existence, it stands opposed to the nation itself. As the immediate being of the ethical order, it stands over against that order, which shapes and maintains itself by working for the universal. The Penates stands opposed to the universal spirit. However, although the family is immediately determined as an ethical being, it is within itself an ethical entity only insofar as it is not the natural relationship of its members, or so far as their connection is an immediate connection of separate actual individuals. For the ethical principle is intrinsically universal, and this natural relationship is just as much a spiritual one, and it is only as a spiritual entity that it is ethical. We have to see what constitutes its peculiar ethical character. In the first place, however, the ethical principle is intrinsically universal. The ethical connection between the members of the family is not that of feeling, or the relationship of love. It seems then that the ethical principle must be placed in the relation of the individual member of the family to the whole family as the substance, so that the end and content of what he does and actually is solely the family, but the conscious end motivating the action of this whole, so far as it is directed towards the whole, is itself the individual. The acquisition and maintenance of power and wealth is in part concerned only with needs, and belongs to the sphere of appetite. In part they become, in their high determination, something that is only mediated. This determination does not fall within the family itself, but bears on what is truly universal, the community. It has rather a negative relation to the family, and consists in expelling the individual from the family, subduing the natural aspect and separateness of his existence, and training him to be virtuous, to a life in and for the universal. The positive end, peculiar to the family, is the individual as such. Now, in order that this relationship be ethical, neither he who performs the action, nor he to whom the action refers, can be in an accidental relationship, as happens, perhaps, in rendering some assistance or service in a particular case. The content of the ethical action must be substantial or whole and universal, Therefore, it can only be related to the whole individual or to the individual qua universal. And this again must not be understood as if it were only imagined that doing him a service would promote his total happiness, whereas the service, being an immediate and actual deed, produces only a particular effect on him. Nor must we imagine that service in the form of education, that is, in a series of efforts, really has him in his entirety for object and produces him as a work, for apart from the purpose which is negatively connected with the family, the actual deed has only a limited content. Finally, just as little should we understand the service as help in time of need, by which in truth the individual in his entirety is rescued, for such help is itself a completely contingent act, the occasion of which is an ordinary reality which can either be or not be. The deed, then, which embraces the entire existence of the blood relation, does not concern the citizen, for he does not belong to the family, nor the individual who is to become a citizen and will cease to count as this particular individual. It has as its object and content this particular individual who belongs to the family, but is taken as a universal being, freed from his sensuous, that is, individual reality. The deed no longer concerns the living but the dead. The individual who, after a long succession of separate disconnected experiences, concentrates himself into a single completed shape, and has raised himself out of the unrest of the accidents of life into the calm of simple universality, but because it is only as a citizen that he is actual and substantial. The individual, so far as he is not a citizen but belongs to the family, is only an unreal, impotent shadow. Don't I know the feeling? This universality which the individual as such attains is pure being, death. It is a state which has been reached immediately in the course of nature, not the result of an action consciously done. The duty of the member of a family is on that account to add this aspect, in order that the individual's ultimate being too shall not belong solely to nature and remain something irrational, but shall be something done, and the right of consciousness be asserted in it. Or rather, the meaning of the action is that, because in truth the calm and universality of a self-conscious being do not belong to nature, the illusory appearance that the death of the individual results from a conscious action on the part of nature may be dispelled, and the truth established. What nature did in the individual is that aspect in which his development into a universal is exhibited as the movement of an immediate existent. This movement falls, it is true, within the ethical community, and has this for its end. Death is the fulfillment and the supreme work which the individual as such undertakes on its behalf. But insofar as he is essentially a particular individual, it is an accident that his death was directly connected with his work for the universal, and was the result of it, partly because if his death was such a result, it is the natural negativity and movement of the individual as a mere existent, in which consciousness does not return into itself and become self-consciousness, or partly because, since the movement of what merely exists consists in its being superseded and becoming a being for self, death is the side of irruption in which the attained being for self is something other than the mere existent which began the movement. Because the ethical order is spirit in its immediate truth, the sides into which its consciousness sunders itself also fall into this form of immediacy and individuality, passes over into this abstract negativity which, being in its own self without consolation and reconciliation, must receive them essentially through a real and external act. A blood relationship supplements, then, the abstract natural process by adding to the movement of consciousness, interrupting the work of nature, and rescuing the blood relation from destruction, or better, because destruction is necessary, the passage of the blood relation into mere being, it takes on itself the act of destruction. Through this it comes about that the dead, the universal being, becomes a being that has returned into itself, and being for self, or the powerless, simply isolated individual, has been raised to universal individuality. The dead individual, by having liberated his being from his action, or his negative unity, is an empty singular, merely a passive being for another, at the mercy of every lower irrational individuality and the forces of abstract mineral elements, all of which are now more powerful than himself, the latter on account of the life they possess, the latter on account of their negative nature. The family keeps away from the dead this dishonouring of him by unconscious appetites and abstract entities, and puts its own action in their place, and weds the blood relation to the bosom of the earth, to the elemental, imperishable individuality. The family thereby makes him a member of a community which prevails over and holds under control the forces of particular material elements and the lower forms of life which sought to unloose themselves against him and to destroy him. Where I wish I was now. This last duty thus constitutes the perfect divine law, or the positive ethical action towards the individual. Every other relationship to him which does not remain one simply of love, but is ethical, belongs to human law and has the negative significance of raising the individual above his confinement within the natural community to which he in his natural existence belongs. Now, although human right has for its content and power the actual ethical substance that is conscious of itself, that is, the entire nation, while the divine right and law has for its content and power the individual who is beyond the real world. Yet he is not without power. His power is the abstract pure universal, the elemental individual, which equally draws back into the pure abstraction, which is its essence, the individuality that breaks loose from the element and constitutes the self-conscious reality of the nation, draws it back into the essence, which is its ground. How this power is manifested in the notion itself, we shall see in the ensuing development. Now, in the one law, as in the other, there are also differences and gradations, for since both laws have within them the moment of consciousness, a difference is developed within the laws themselves, and this constitutes their movement and their own peculiar life. Consideration of these differences reveals the way in which they operate, and the mode of self-consciousness of the two universal essential natures of the ethical world, and also their connection and transition into one another. The community, the superior law, whose validity is openly apparent, has its real vitality in the government as that in which it has its individual form. Government is the reality of spirit that is reflected into itself, the simple self of the entire ethical substance. This simple power does indeed allow the family to expand into its constituent members, and to give to each part an enduring being, and a being for self of its own. Spirit has in this its reality or its objective existence, and the family is the element of this reality. But spirit is at the same time the power of the whole, which brings these parts together again into the negative unity, giving them the feeling of their lack of independence, and keeping them aware that they have their life only in the whole. The community may, on the one hand, organize itself into systems of personal independence and property of laws relating to persons and things, and on the other hand, the various ways of working for ends which are, in the first instance, particular ends. Those of pain and enjoyment it may articulate into their own special and independent associations. The spirit of universal assembly and association is the simple and negative essence of those systems which tend to isolate themselves, in order not to let them become rooted and set in this isolation, thereby breaking up the whole and letting the communal spirit evaporate. A government has from time to time to shake them to their core by war. By this means the government upsets their established order and violates their right to independence, while the individuals who, absorbed in their own way of life, break loose from the whole and strive after the inviolable independence and security of the person, are made to feel in the task laid on them their lord and master, death. Spirit, by thus throwing into the melting pot the stable existence of these systems, checks their tendency to fall away from the ethical order, and to be submerged in a merely natural existence, and it preserves and raises conscious self into freedom and its own power. The negative essence shows itself to be the real power of the community and the force of its self-preservation. The community therefore possesses the truth and the confirmation of its power in the essence of the divine law and in the realm of the netherworld. The divine law which governs the family has likewise on its side differences within itself, whose interrelationships constitute the living process of its actuality. But among these relationships of husband and wife, parents and children, brothers and sisters, the relationship of husband and wife is in the first place the one in which one consciousness immediately recognizes itself in another, and in which there is knowledge of this mutual recognition. Because this self-recognition is a natural and not an ethical one, it is only a representation, an image of spirit, and not actually spirit itself. A representation or image, however, has its actual existence in something other than itself. This relationship, therefore, has its actual existence not in itself, but in the child. Another whose coming into existence in the relationship is the relationship, and is also that in which the relationship itself gradually passes away, and this alternation of successive generations has its enduring basis in the nation. The dutiful reverence of husband and wife towards each other is thus mixed with a natural relation and with feeling, and the return into self of the relationship does not take place within the relationship itself. Similarly, with the second relationship, the dutiful reverence of parents and children towards one another. That of parents towards their children is emotionally affected by the fact that the objective reality of the relationship does not exist in them, but in the children, and by their witnessing the development in the children of an independent existence which they are unable to take back again. The independent existence of the children remains an alien reality, a reality all its own. That of children towards parents is emotionally affected, conversely, by the fact that they derive their existence from, or have their essential being in, what is other than themselves, and passes away, and by their attaining independence and a self-consciousness of their own, only by being separated from their source, a separation in which the source dries up. Both these relationships are confined within the transition and the disparity of the sides which are assigned to them. The relationship in its unmixed form is found, however, in that between brother and sister. They are the same blood, which has, however, in them reached a state of rest and equilibrium. Therefore they do not desire one another, nor have they given to or received from one another this independent being for self. On the contrary, they are free individualities in regard to each other. Consequently, the feminine in the form of the sister has the highest intuitive awareness of what is ethical. She does not attain to consciousness of it, or to the objective existence of it, because the law of the family is an implicit inner essence which is not exposed to the daylight of consciousness, but remains an inner feeling and the divine element that is exempt from an existence in the real world. The woman is associated with these household gods, penates, and beholds in them both her universal substance and her particular individuality, yet in such a way that this relation of her individuality to them is at the same time not the natural one of desire. As a daughter, the woman must now see her parents pass away with a natural emotion and ethical resignation, for it is only at the cost of this relationship that she can achieve that existence of her own of which she is capable. Thus, in the parents, she does not behold her own being or self in a positive form. The relationship of mother and wife, however, are those of particular individuals, partly in the form of something natural pertaining to desire, partly in the form of something negative, which sees in those relationships only something evanescent, and also, again, the particular individual is for that very reason a contingent element, which can be replaced by another individual. In the ethical household, it is not a question of this particular husband, this particular child, but simply of husband and children generally. The relationship of the woman the relationships of the woman are based not on feeling, but on the universal. The difference between the ethical life of the woman and that of the man consists just in this, that in her vocation as an individual and in her pleasure, her interest is centered on the universal and remains alien to the particularity of desire. Whereas in the husband these two sides are separated, and since he possesses as a citizen the self-conscious power of universality, he thereby acquires the right of desire and at the same time preserves his freedom in regard to it. Since then, in this relationship of the wife, there is a mixture of particularity, her ethical life is not pure. But insofar as it is ethical, the particularity is a matter of indifference, and the wife is without the moment of knowing herself as this particular self in the other partner. The brother, however, is for the sister a passive similar being, in general, and the recognition of herself in him is pure and unmixed with any natural desire. In this relationship, therefore, the indifference of the particularity and the ethical contingency of the latter are not present, but the moment of the individual self, recognizing and being recognized, can here assert its right, because it is linked to the equilibrium of the blood, and is a relation devoid of desire. The loss of the brother is therefore irreparable to the sister, and her duty toward him is the highest. This relationship is at the same time the limit at which the self-contained life of the family breaks up and goes beyond itself. The brother is the member of the family in whom its spirit becomes an individuality, which turns towards another sphere and passes over into the consciousness of universality. The brother leaves this immediate elemental, and therefore, strictly speaking, negative ethical life of the family in order to acquire and produce the ethical life that is conscious of itself and actual. It passes from the divine law, within whose sphere he lived, over to the human law, but the sister becomes, or the wife remains, the head of the household and the guardian of the divine law. In this way, the two sexes overcome their merely a natural being and appear in their ethical significance as diverse beings who share between them the two distinctions belonging to the ethical substance. These two universal beings of the ethical world have, therefore, their specific individuality in naturally distinct self-consciousnesses, because the ethical spirit is the immediate unity of the substance with self-consciousness, an immediacy which appears, therefore, both from the sides of reality and of difference, as the existence of a natural difference. It is that side which, in the shape of individuality that is real to itself, showed itself in the notion of spiritual being as an originally determinate nature. This moment loses the indeterminateness which it still has there, and the contingent diversity of dispositions and capacities. It is now the specific antithesis of the two sexes whose natural existence acquires at the same time the significance of their ethical determination. The difference of the sexes and their ethical content remains, however, in the unity of the substance, and its movement is just the constant becoming of that substance. The husband is sent out by the spirit of the family into the community, in which he finds his self-conscious being, just as the family in this way possesses in the community its substance and enduring being, so conversely the community possesses in the family the formal element of its actual existence, and in the divine law its power and authentication. Neither of the two is by itself absolutely valid. Human law proceeds in its living process from the divine, the law valid on earth from that of the netherworld, the conscious from the unconscious, mediation from immediacy, and equally returns whence it came. The power of the netherworld, on the other hand, has its actual existence on earth. Through consciousness it becomes existence and activity. The universal ethical beings are then the substance qua universal, and the substance qua an individual consciousness. Their universal actuality is the nation and the family, while they have their natural self and operative individuality in man and woman. In this content of the ethical world we see achieved those ends which the previous insubstantial forms of consciousness set themselves. What reason apprehended only as object has become self-consciousness, and what the latter possessed only within itself is now present as a true objective reality. What observation knew as a given object in which the self has no part is here a given custom, but a reality which is at the same time the deed and the work of the subject finding it. The individual who seeks the pleasure of enjoying his individuality finds it in the family, and the necessity in which that pleasure passes away is his own self-consciousness as a citizen of his nation. The universal ethical beings are then the substance qua universal and the substance qua an individual consciousness. Their universal actuality is the nation and the family, while they have their natural self and operative individuality in man and woman. In this content of the ethical world, we see achieved those ends which the previous insubstantial forms of consciousness set themselves. What reason apprehended only as object has become self-consciousness, and what the latter possessed only within itself is now present as a true objective reality. What observation knew as a given object in which the self had its no part is here a given custom, but a reality which is at the same time the deed and the work of the subject finding it. The individual who seeks the pleasure of enjoying his individuality finds it in the family, and the necessity in which that pleasure passes away is his own self-consciousness as a citizen of his nation. Or again, it is in knowing that the law of his own heart is the law of all hearts, in knowing the consciousness of the self as the acknowledged universal order. It is virtue which enjoys the fruits of its sacrifice, which brings about what it sets out to do, viz., to bring forth the essence into the light of day, and its enjoyment is his universal life. Finally, consciousness of the matter in hand itself finds satisfaction in the real substance, which contains and preserves in a positive manner the abstract moments of that empty category. That substance has, in the ethical powers, a genuine content that takes the place of the insubstantial commandments which sound reason wanted to give and to know, and thus it gets an intrinsically determinate standard for testing. Not the laws, but what is done. The whole is a stable equilibrium of all the parts, and each part is a spirit at home in this whole, a spirit which does not seek its satisfaction outside of itself, but finds it within itself, because it is itself in this equilibrium with the whole. This equilibrium can, it is true, only be a living one by inequality arising in it, and being brought back to equilibrium by justice. Justice, however, is neither an alien entity, remote from this whole, nor the reality, unworthy of the name of justice, or of mutual malice, treachery, ingratitude, etc., which would execute judgment in an unreasoning arbitrary manner by misunderstanding the content of the context of the action, and by unconscious acts of omission and commission. On the contrary, it is the justice of human law which brings back into the universal the element of being for self, which has broken away from the balanced whole, namely the independent classes and individuals. It is the government of the nation which is the self-affirming individuality of the universal essence and the self-conscious will of all. The justice, however, which brings back to equilibrium the universal in its ascendancy over the individual, is equally the simple spirit of the individual who has suffered wrong. It is not split up into two, the one who has suffered the wrong and an entity in a remote beyond. The individual himself is the power of the netherworld, and it is his heaviness, his fury, which wreaks vengeance, for his individuality, his blood, still lives on in the household. His substance has an enduring reality. The wrong which can be inflicted on the individual in the ethical realm is simply this, that something merely happens to him. The power which inflicts this wrong on the conscious individual of making him into a mere thing is nature. It is the universality not of the community, but the abstract universality of mere being, and the individual in avenging the wrong he has suffered does not turn against the former, for it is not at his hands that he has suffered, but against the latter. As we saw, the consciousness of those who share the blood of the individual repair this wrong in such a way that what has simply happened becomes rather a work deliberately done in order that the mere being of the wrong, its ultimate form, may also be something willed, and thus something agreeable. The ethical realm is in this way its enduring existence as an immaculate in its enduring existence an immaculate world, a world unsullied by any internal dissension. Similarly, its process is a tranquil transition of one of its powers into the other, in such a way that each preserves and brings forth the other. We do indeed see it divide itself into two essences and their reality, but their antithesis is rather the authentication of one through the other, and where they come into direct contact with each other as real opposites, their middle term and common element is their immediate interpenetration. The one extreme, the universal self-conscious spirit, becomes through the individuality of the man, united with the other extreme, its force and element, with unconscious spirit. On the other hand, the divine law has its individualization, or the unconscious spirit of the individual its real existence. In the woman through whom, as the middle term, the unconscious spirit rises out of its unreality into actual existence, out of a state in which it is unknowing and unconscious, into the realm of conscious spirit. The union of man and woman constitutes the active middle term of the whole, and the element which thunders itself into these extremes of divine and human law. It is equality, their immediate union, which converts those first two syllogisms into one and the same syllogism, and unites into one process the opposite movements, one from actuality down to unreality, the downward movement of human law, organised into independent members, to the danger and trial of death, and the other the upward movement of the law of the netherworld, to the actuality of the light of day, and to conscious existence. Of these movements, the former falls to men, the latter to woman. Happy times. Having a drink with a nice lady. Although I sometimes think I'm living in the wrong age.